Okay, so now we'll talk about the last president we're going to cover with this screencast, and then on Tuesday we'll finish it out with James Monroe. But first, let's talk about James Madison. So James Madison was a Democratic Republican. Do you remember his nickname, the name that he's given, gives him some credit? Remember, he's considered the father of the Constitution. And when James Madison comes into power, into office, things are very tense between America and some of these European countries. France and Britain are obviously still ignoring America's right to trade with who they want to freely. But James Madison and America as a whole are really having the most troubles with Britain, because remember, Britain is also kind of causing problems in America with their troops still being there as well. So there starts to get pressure, pressure starts building to go to war against Britain. And certain Republican congressmen, specifically John Calhoun and Henry Clay, they really put pressure on Madison to go to war. Because remember, it's the president who actually would ask Congress to formally declare war. So these two men, John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay, they're known as war hawks. Okay, they're considered the two war hawks that are putting pressure on Congress and Madison. Let's go to war with Great Britain. And yes, let's just take a moment to note how scary John C. Calhoun is. Yes, he scares me too. Okay. So, because we cannot get anywhere in reasoning with Britain, like the third or fourth year in his presidency, and he asks Congress to declare war on Great Britain, and this leads us to the War of 1812. War was very hard. This comes at a really bad time for America because Jefferson had just reduced the size of the army and he cut military spending. So the army didn't have as much of the funds as it needed to really fight a strong fight, okay? Also, there were political divisions. Not everyone supported the war. Since Madison was a Democratic Republican and he asked Congress to declare, and it was the Republicans in Congress who were really pushing for war, you can infer that it was the Federalists who did not agree with the war. In 1814, the British attacked our nation's capital in Washington and burned down the White House. And this is for the famous instance of Dolly Madison. This is where Dolly Madison saves the portrait of George Washington. So we give her that credit. She was a brave first lady for saving Washington's portrait. And James Madison and Dolly both get away. Another important, and we're kind of just skimming the surface of this war, you guys, but another important event during the War of 1812 is this is where we get the Star-Spangled Banner. The British attacked Fort McHenry, which is in Baltimore. And they actually lost. The Americans won this battle. And so we have Francis Scott Key writing the very famous Star-Spangled Banner that becomes our national anthem. Eventually. It doesn't actually happen until the 1900s, but you don't have to know that. So Americans win the battle at Fort McHenry. But overall, it's looking rough for America, as we don't have the funds we really need to win. And the Federalists start thinking, maybe we can gain back some of our power since this war was such a flop. Oh, do I not have anything about the Hartford Convention? Okay. Let me just back up here for a second. I thought I had a slide that said, I want you to go. Should maybe be in your... Hartford is spelled Hartford. Hartford Convention. Okay. The Federalists organize the Hartford Convention, and they want to reform the U.S. government. They mainly just want to revise the Constitution, but it was their effort to kind of gain back some control from the Democratic Republicans. Unfortunately, it will be a flop, which is actually good for the Americans, I guess, but since they don't want to start another disagreement between two parties, but it's a flop for the Federalists because England's ready to make peace. They actually, even though they probably could win this war, they are tired of using their resources. Remember, they're still fighting a war in Europe. So they want to make peace, and eventually we have another treaty. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in Christmas Eve, 1814, and this ends the War of 1812. It basically states they will stop fighting. Again, I'm sure the British are again promising we'll remove our troops, but there are no border changes. The Americans don't gain any more land, and England doesn't gain any more land from them either. So all the border lines will stay the same. Remember, the British are still in North America, being in Canada. Now, here's the irony, and the best part of this story is that before the news, this occurred in the very end of 1814, before news of the war ending made it all the way around the country, we had the Battle of New Orleans. Okay? So the Battle of New Orleans, famously led by Andrew Jackson, actually occurred after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, but it happened in January of 1815, and they just did not know yet. So General Andrew Jackson led the American army into battle in New Orleans against the British, and it was an impressive victory for the Americans. And this makes Andrew Jackson look like a war hero. So that's a little bit of foreshadowing there. He really does look like a war hero. Even though it's kind of ironic since the war was already over, so it's kind of pointless. But still, it's awesome that they won. And this is, of course, why we accredit Andrew Jackson in New Orleans with the very famous Jackson Square and his statue in the middle of it in front of the cathedral. Okay, after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party fell to pieces. Okay, 1812 they had not supported the war, and the war was a big morale boost for America. Plus, the Federalists had already kind of begun falling apart with John Adams passing or approving of unfavorable acts such as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And also the Hartford Convention looked very un-American, anti-America. So basically the Federalist Party ceases to exist, and we have the end of the first party system. So we currently now have just Democratic Republicans in power, which is good, but eventually we'll see that divide as well, but later on. Okay, the last thing we'll talk about with James Madison is the renewal of the bank charter. Okay, and we know that the original bank charter was created for 20 years, and Congress and Madison will eventually approve a second national bank charter. It again will be another 20-year charter. So just know that the 20-year charter was approved for a second time, so reapproved, and that's foreshadowing because this is going to cause problems for a president down the line. Okay, but James Madison is the president for the renewal of the national bank that was originally established under George Washington's administration. Okay, make sure you listen to both of these screencasts as many times as you need, or for my honors class it'll only be this one, but make sure you listen to it. Please write down any questions and come to class on Tuesday with any questions, okay? I want to first go over and review with you what you've learned in these two screencasts, and then we'll move on to our last president of the first five, James Monroe. Okay? Y'all enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.